Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a topic that honestly absolutely blew my mind. When we picture the modern United States military, we naturally think of things like F-35 fighter jets, aircraft carriers, and this distinctly American story born from democratic ideals and just massive industrial might. But what if I told you the organizational code running that entire hyper-modern machine was actually written centuries ago in the freezing forests of Europe? The sources we're digging into today actually reveal a profound, almost hidden European root to this immense apparatus.
So this brings up a massive paradox, right? How exactly did American democracy end up adopting a Prussian military operating system? Think about it. On one hand, you have the fiercely democratic, inherently rebellious, egalitarian ideals of the United States. And on the other, you have the rigid, highly structured 19th century autocratic methods of Prussia and the German Empire. It literally seems like oil and water. Yet it's these exact autocratic, heavily disciplined structures that secretly powered the American military machine today.
The answer lies in this fascinating concept our sources call the Prussian Continuum. It's essentially a seamless blending of egalitarian ideals powered by Prussian mechanics. Throughout this explainer, we're going to trace this incredible continuum. We'll journey from the starving, chaotic camps of the American Revolutionary War all the way to the supersonic doctrines of the modern U.S. Air Force. It is a wild story of how a democratic nation quietly adopted the DNA of an autocratic military powerhouse to survive and ultimately to dominate.
Section 1. The Hidden Prussian DNA.
Our journey spans centuries here, tracking a very deliberate evolution. We kick things off in the brutal winter of 1778 with Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge, which is arguably the moment the American military was actually born. From there, the influence deepens with the influx of German 48ers fighting in the American Civil War in the 1860s. Then we hit a massive structural earthquake with the 1903 route reforms and finally arrive at the post-World War II technical explosion of Operation Paperclip in 1945. What we're tracking here isn't just about how troops march. It's a dramatic evolution from physical drill to deep structural organization and finally to advanced technical superiority.
Let's zoom in on that first critical stop. When Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge, the Continental Army wasn't really an army at all. It was a starving, freezing, and chaotic collection of disparate militias who honestly couldn't even march in step. Steuben, utilizing his rigorous Prussian general staff background, implemented a highly structured three-step system. First, he didn't overwhelm himself by trying to train the entire camp. Instead, he handpicked and trained a model company of about 100 men. Second, he created a massive multiplier effect by sending those trained men back to their own regiments to teach the others. And third, he ruthlessly standardized the drill. He was actually famous for swearing at the troops in German, then French, and eventually having his aides translate his curses into broken English. But, the tough love worked. He took a broken, dying force and systematically forged them into a disciplined, lethal unit.
Steuben's impact was a matter of literal life and death. He created the Inspector General role to obsessively track supplies and cut down on rampant craft. Even more importantly, he introduced standardized camp sanitation, strictly zoning out kitchens from latrines. Before Steuben, soldiers were literally dying from entirely preventable diseases just by living in their own filth. He also unified battle tactics, specifically introducing bayonet combat, which finally gave the Americans a psychological edge against the British. And he codified all of this in his Blue Book, the first true unified doctrine for the U.S. military. So Steuben didn't just teach the Americans how to shoot, he taught them how to exist and survive as an institutional army.
Section 2. Building a Central Brain.
Fast forward a bit. By the time the Spanish-American War kicked off in 1898, the physical discipline was there, but the U.S. Army faced a massive new crisis. It was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Troops were stranded in places like Tampa, trains were full of rotting meat, and competing generals were stepping all over each other's toes. The chaos was so absolute that in 1902, Secretary of War Eli Hurut bluntly stated that the Army was defective at the top. The chain of command was just completely fractured. Basically, the military had grown entirely too complex to run without a unifying central intelligence directing the whole show.
Hurut's solution to this chaos was frankly audacious. He looked directly across the Atlantic and essentially copy-pasted the German Kriegsakademie, the Prussian general staff. He saw their rigorous, merit-based selection and their deep 3-year strategic curriculum, and he used that exact blueprint to create the U.S. General Staff and the Army War College in 1903. This wasn't just some minor policy tweak. It was a complete structural transplant.
He directly emulated the German model to build an institutional brain that could handle intelligence gathering, long-term strategic planning, and central direction for the American military.
Section 3. The philosophy of friction.
With that structural brain in place, we move to the deep philosophical roots that still govern modern warfare today. And that brings us to Karl von Clausewitz, the legendary 19th century Prussian military theorist. Clausewitz defined a concept called friction. He described it as the unseen force that makes the apparently easy so incredibly difficult. It's the fog of war. Think of a radio dying in a storm, a map being drawn upside down, or just a frantic, misheard order. Our sources point out that recognizing this friction is utterly essential because the reality of modern industrial warfare is pure, unadulterated chaos. Acknowledging that chaos requires a completely different approach to leadership.
Clausewitz also introduced his most profound concept, the Trinity. He argued that war is a complex interplay of three distinct forces. First, primordial violence, which is driven by the passions of the people. Second, chance and probability, which is the chaotic realm of the army and the commander. And third, reason, the calculated political objectives of the government. It is wild to think that a 19th century framework built for muskets and cavalry is the literal cornerstone of strategy courses taught to modern pilots flying F-35s at the U.S. Air War College today. But they use this exact centuries-old framework to analyze the world's most modern conflicts.
Section 4. The Genesis of Mission Command. If Clausewitz perfectly identified the chaos and friction of war, another brilliant Prussian commander figured out how to actually overcome it. Meet Helmuth von Moltke the Elder. Moltke looked at the sprawling nature of industrial warfare and realized something really profound. Minute-by-minute centralized control from a general standing on a hill? Completely impossible. The battlefield is just too big and it's moving way too fast. So he institutionalized something revolutionary called Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. It's a system where a commander gives a very clear objective and communicates their intent, but then does something incredibly difficult for a leader to do. They completely let go of the reins. They leave the specific execution entirely up to the subordinates on the ground. Basically, you tell your people exactly what needs to be achieved, but you trust them to figure out how to do it.
Whether you're a 19th century commander directing horse-drawn artillery or a modern officer communicating with a supersonic jet, the core mechanic is identical, trusting the frontline operator to adapt to the chaos. The philosophy evolved across centuries, leaping from the muddy fields of Europe right into the aerospace domain. But that fundamental trust in the subordinate's localized judgment, that remains exactly the same.
When you map it all out like a Rosetta Stone, the translations are almost eerie. Daunting, complex German concepts translate flawlessly into everyday U.S. military vocabulary. What the Prussians called the Schwerpunkt, the U.S. simply rebranded as strategic targeting, or striking the center of gravity. Auftragstaktik, as we just discussed, became the absolute bedrock of mission command. And the Kriegsakademie birthed the entire multi-billion-dollar concept of American professional military education. It is an incredible, seamless integration of ideas.
And this brings us to the absolute climax of this doctrinal evolution, perfectly crystallized in the core U.S. Air Force tenet, centralized control and decentralized execution. This is the ultimate modern realization of Moltke's Prussian theory. Picture this for a second. The massive central brain in the Pentagon can spend 6 months mapping out a global overarching campaign. That's the centralized control. But in the heat of battle, when friction and the fog of war inevitably roll in, success relies entirely on decentralized execution. It relies on a 25-year-old pilot flying at Mach 1.5 over hostile airspace, feeling empowered to make a split-second tactical decision right there in the cockpit. It is pure Prussian doctrine successfully applied to mastering the skies.
Section 5. The American Adaptation.
Now, adopting this DNA required a pretty profound cultural translation to actually work, because you really have to understand the American character. European recruits were historically expected to offer rote, unquestioning obedience. You give an order, they follow it, no questions asked. But American recruits, they are famously inherently stubborn and egalitarian. You can't just bark orders at an American soldier. They inevitably want to know the why behind the command. Leaders like Baron von Steuben and later Civil War commanders like August Willich quickly realized that this wasn't a weakness, it was actually a superpower. Because Americans demanded to know the commander's intent, this unique cultural trait made the American military the absolute perfect environment for true mission command to flourish. And it wasn't just doctrine we adapted to win the modern era. Following World War II, under Operation Paperclip, the U.S. quietly brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. The U.S. government realized that to build the Cold War Air Force, they didn't just need German philosophy, they needed their literal technical superiority. From swept-wing jets to the Saturn V rocket that eventually took us to the moon, this physical brain drain was a massive, deliberate injection of German expertise that permanently tilted the balance of the Cold War.
Conclusion: the permanent imprint. As our sources explicitly state, the American way of war was forged in the crucible of Prussia. From the frozen, desperate fields of Valley Forge to the modern, high-tech corridors of the Pentagon, our fiercely democratic military power rests fundamentally on this deeply ingrained, centuries-old Prussian DNA. It's a brilliant, lasting, and somewhat ironic synthesis of autocratic efficiency and democratic initiative.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to linger on. If our modern democratic forces run so heavily on an autocratic operating system built for human commanders, how will this hidden DNA adapt to the highly automated, algorithm-driven battlefields of the future? When artificial intelligence starts processing the fog of war in mere milliseconds, what happens to Moltke's human mission command? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the hidden structures around you, and as always, keep learning.